The Miller house stood like so many others in the small Ohio town, its white wooden siding weathered by years of harsh winters and humid summers, the porch sagging slightly where generations had sat in silence, staring out at a world that rarely changed. Inside the walls carried echoes of old conversations and unspoken tensions holding secrets in their paint and wood. To an outsider, the home might appear charming, even ordinary. But to Sarah Miller, it had become a place of quiet suffocation. A place where every step she took was measured, where her existence was tolerated rather than embraced. Sarah had entered this house 5 years earlier, newly married, full of hope, and armed with the belief that her patience and kindness would carve a space for her in this family. She had grown up in a modest household herself, taught by her mother that dignity came not from loud declarations, but from service, from gentleness, from meeting conflict with calm. She had believed this philosophy would sustain her through marriage. But the Miller house was different. It demanded more than she could give, and yet never enough. Her mornings began before anyone else stirred. She moved through the kitchen in the half-light hands, tracing familiar motions, measuring coffee grounds, slicing bread, setting plates on the table with careful precision. Each gesture was a silent plea for approval, though she would never have admitted it to herself. She wanted harmony. She wanted peace. She wanted to feel like she belonged. But belonging in the Miller household was a shifting horizon, always retreating just when she thought she had reached it. Linda Miller, her mother-in-law, carried authority in her very presence. A woman of 58 with the sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a voice honed by decades of command, Linda did not shout to make herself heard. She dismissed with a glance, diminished with a sigh. To Linda, Sarah was useful, but never worthy. Meals were eaten, laundry folded, errands run, and yet the acknowledgement never came. Instead, there was only the occasional comment, "The bread is a little dry," or "You should iron Daniel's shirts more neatly." Words that carried the weight of judgment, not guidance. Then there was Jessica, the youngest, Miller still living at home, though nearly 30. Jessica embodied everything. Sarah was not sharp-tongued, careless, unfiltered. She relished her role as the critic, the spark that kept the household's discontent alive. Jessica had grown accustomed to being the center of her mother's attention, and Sarah's presence threatened that orbit. And so she needled, she poked, she twisted small mistakes into unforgivable flaws. "It must be nice," Jessica once said with feigned innocence, "to live here rent-free while the rest of us actually contribute." The words had stung, though Sarah's contribution was the very backbone of the household. Without her, the meals, the cleaning, the quiet tending of daily life would collapse. But acknowledgement was not what Jessica sought, dominance was. Robert Miller, the patriarch, was a quieter force. He rarely spoke more than a few sentences at dinner, his voice gravelly from years of factory work. He neither condemned nor defended Sarah, existing in a neutrality that to her felt like complicity. In his silence, she heard his agreement with Linda and Jessica, his acceptance that Sarah would always be the outsider. If he ever saw her pain, he gave no sign. That hurt in its own way, his silence was a verdict more powerful than words. And then there was Daniel, her husband. He loved her, Sarah believed that much, but his love was fragile, hesitant. He stood in the shadow of his parents, never stepping forward to shield her from their disdain. His kindness showed itself in private moments, a hand on her shoulder, when no one was watching, a whispered reassurance in the quiet of their bedroom. But when it mattered, when his mother or sister's barbs struck, he retreated. Sarah knew he feared confrontation, feared fracturing the brittle peace of the household. But every silence from him chipped away at the foundation of her trust. Love without protection felt hollow. The walls of the Miller house held these dynamics like a script performed nightly. Meals around the table where words were few, but glances spoke volumes. Evenings in the living room where television filled the silence and Sarah sat with folded hands, eyes lowered, careful not to intrude. She became skilled at invisibility, at molding herself into the background, hoping that absence would shield her from attack. Yet, invisibility came at a cost. It erased her. What made the burden heavier was Sarah's own nature. She was not one to fight, not one to scream or slam doors. She carried herself with a grace that was both her strength and her downfall. Where another woman might have confronted Linda's cruelty or Jessica's malice, Sarah responded with silence, with more effort, with deeper sacrifice. She thought that if she gave enough, if she bore enough, the tide would shift, but tides in the Miller household only pulled further away. Still, there were small moments of light. Sarah found solace in attending the small patch of garden behind the house. It was not much, just a strip of earth with stubborn soil, but she coaxed life from it, planting lavender and wildflowers that stood resilient against neglect. There, among the blooms, she felt a fragment of herself returning. The flowers needed her, and they thrived under her hands. Unlike the family she served, they offered silent gratitude. The garden became her refuge, the one place in the house that truly belonged to her. The neighbors sometimes waved when she walked to the store, their casual kindness a reminder that the world outside was not always so harsh. She imagined what it would be like to live alone in a small apartment, to cook for herself, to breathe air untainted by judgment. But imagination was a luxury she barely allowed herself. Duty bound her to the Millers, or so she believed. Marriage was not something to abandon, not when vows had been spoken beneath the vaulted ceiling of a church, not when she had promised forever, and so she endured. Yet endurance is not infinite. Each day in the Miller house was a drop in a bucket already too full. The condescension, the criticisms, the mockery, all were drops accumulating. Sarah felt the weight, but pushed it aside, convincing herself that tomorrow might be different. But tomorrow only repeated today, and the bucket grew heavier. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Jessica's voice sliced through the quiet. She commented on Sarah's cooking, a casual cruelty disguised as humor, and Linda laughed. Daniel stared at his plate. Robert cleared his throat but said nothing. Sarah felt the weight of their dismissal settle on her chest. It was not a single moment that broke her, but the accumulation of them all. The silent walls of the Miller house had absorbed her identity, pressing it into silence, into submission. And she, weary and unseen, wondered how much longer she could carry the burden. The days in the Miller household did not change. They followed the rhythm of routine, each hour, pressing against Sarah with the quiet persistence of a water dripping onto stone. What made it heavier was not the chores themselves, but the weight of expectation that, no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. The week after Jessica's sharp comment at dinner, the atmosphere in the house seemed even more taut, though no one spoke of it. Sarah felt the walls watching her. She folded laundry with mechanical precision, her fingers smoothing out wrinkles that no one else would notice. She cooked meals with care, adjusting seasonings, adjusting temperatures, hoping that maybe this time someone would say thank you. But thanks was a foreign word in this house. The silence at the table was its replacement. One morning, as sunlight filtered through thin curtains, Sarah overheard voices in the living room. Linda and Jessica were speaking in hushed tones, but the house carried sound too well. "She thinks she belongs here," Jessica said, her words dripping with disdain. "As if doing chores makes her part of this family. She's just convenient." Linda's sigh followed, weary but firm. Daniel should have chosen differently. He's too soft, too blind. She doesn't fit. She never did. Sarah froze in the hallway, her hands clutching a basket of folded clothes. She felt the air leave her lungs, her chest tightening as if the walls themselves pressed inward. She had always known she was not enough for them, but to hear it spoken aloud was something different. It was confirmation. The invisible chains she carried each day tightened. At dinner that evening, Jessica made a pointed remark about the bills being higher than usual. Her eyes darted to Sarah. "Maybe someone's been running the washer too often. Some people don't understand what it means to pay for things." Linda's lips curved in a faint smile. Robert looked down at his plate. Daniel shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Sarah swallowed her food, each bite like ash in her mouth. Her silence was interpreted as guilt, and guilt was exactly what they wanted her to feel. It was always this way. Whenever a problem arose, Sarah became the convenient scapegoat. If a dish was chipped, if a bill was higher, if a neighbor's comment seemed out of place somehow, it circled back to her. And Daniel, though he loved her in his quiet way, never stood tall in those moments. His eyes would flicker toward her apologetic, but his voice would not rise. He was a man caught between his mother's expectations and his wife's dignity, and his weakness cut her more deeply than the insults of the others. The weight of invisible chains was not in the work Sarah performed, but in the constant erosion of her worth. Every day, she sacrificed a part of herself, her voice, her identity, her quiet dreams. She told herself it was for the marriage, for the vow she had made, for the hope that one day love would outweigh cruelty. But that hope was thinning, unraveling like old fabric. There were moments when she tried to remind herself who she was before she entered this house. She remembered the girl who painted watercolors by the lake in her hometown, who laughed easily with friends who believed life would unfold with beauty. That girl felt like a ghost, now someone she had once known but could no longer reach. The garden behind the Miller house was the only thread that tied her back to that version of herself. The flowers whispering to her that she was more than the role she had been forced into, but Jessica knew how to strike where it hurt most. One late afternoon, as Sarah returned from the market carrying bags of groceries, Jessica stood on the porch, arms crossed, smirking. "You know," Jessica said, her tone dripping with contempt, "it must be nice to spend Daniel's money all day. What exactly do you contribute?" "Sarah, cooking, cleaning. That's hardly a life." Sarah felt the sting, her face flushing, though she kept her voice steady. "I do what I can for this family." Jessica's laugh was sharp. "This isn't your family. Don't fool yourself." The words burrowed deep, not because they were new, but because they echoed the whispers Sarah had heard from Linda. They confirmed what she feared: she was an outsider in her own home. That night, Sarah lay awake beside Daniel. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the ceiling. Daniel breathed evenly asleep while Sarah stared at the shadows. She wanted to wake him, to tell him everything, how his silence was breaking her, how Jessica's cruelty hollowed her out, how Linda's disdain drained her spirit. But the words caught in her throat. She was tired of pleading for what should have been given freely: respect, protection, love that did not vanish in the face of conflict. The invisible chains tightened further when a week later a small sum of money went missing from Linda's purse. It was not much, but enough to spark suspicion. Linda confronted the family at the table. "I don't misplace things," she said coldly, her eyes scanning each face. Then her gaze landed on Sarah. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. "I would never," Sarah began, her voice trembling. Jessica interrupted with a sly tone. "Well, you were in the room earlier, weren't you? Maybe you didn't mean to, but things happen." Robert shifted in his chair, saying nothing. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw tight. The verdict was already cast. Sarah felt heat rise in her chest, tears threatening but unspilled. She excused herself from the table, her legs carrying her to the small garden where the twilight wrapped around her like a cloak. She knelt among the flowers, pressing her hands into the soil as if the earth could absorb her sorrow. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry openly, her sobs muffled by the night air. It was there on the ground with the dirt beneath her nails and tears streaking her cheeks that Sarah realized how deeply the chains had sunk into her skin. She was bound not by love, but by obligation and fear. She had given everything and received nothing in return but contempt. Still, she returned to the house, wiping her face, straightening her shoulders. She endured. That was her way, but endurance has limits, and the Miller household was testing hers with every passing day. The first cracks in her body's resilience were beginning to show: fatigue that clung to her bones, headaches that pulsed behind her eyes, a weariness that sleep could not erase. She dismissed them as stress, telling herself she only needed rest, telling herself tomorrow would be lighter. But the weight of invisible chains does not lift on its own. It grows heavier, pulling a person closer to collapse. And collapse was coming. Sarah felt it in her body, in her spirit, though she did not yet know the name of the storm gathering inside her. The early autumn air in Ohio carried with it a damp chill, the kind that seeped into the bones and lingered long after the sun had risen. Sarah felt that chill more acutely than others. Her body, once steady in its rhythms, now betrayed her. She moved through the Miller household with the same quiet diligence, yet her limbs grew heavier each day, her steps slower. There was a weariness that no amount of sleep could lift, an ache in her chest that pulsed with a warning she refused to name. At first, she dismissed it. Fatigue could be explained by stress headaches, by the constant tension of living in a house that regarded her as both invisible and inconvenient. But the symptoms deepened. She woke drenched in sweat some nights, her pulse unsteady, a heaviness pressing against her ribs as though something inside her was claiming space it should not. She brushed it aside because brushing things aside had become second nature. It was Emily who noticed. They had run into each other by chance outside the small grocery store. Emily Carter, once Sarah's classmate in high school, now a nurse at the local hospital. Her presence was like a window cracked open in a stifling room. Fresh air, unexpected relief. "You don't look well," Emily said, gently studying her with the kind of eyes trained to see beyond the surface. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted. Her voice practiced in the art of dismissal, but Emily didn't look convinced. She scribbled her number on a slip of paper, pressing it into Sarah's hand. "If it gets worse, call me, please." That night, Sarah lay awake again, the ache stronger, a dull throb beneath her ribs. She thought of Emily's eyes filled not with judgment, but concern. She thought of how rare it was in her current life to be seen that way. And so, after another morning of dizziness that forced her to grip the counter to steady herself, she made the decision to go. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sterility, a sharp contrast to the stale heaviness of the Miller home. Sarah sat in a chair too large for her frame, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Emily appeared at her side, offering a reassuring smile before leading her through the halls. Tests were run, scans taken, blood drawn. Machines hummed, lights flickered, questions were asked and answered. Hours later, Sarah sat across from the doctor. His words came in measured tones, clinical yet careful. A mass, abnormal growth, requires immediate attention. The word he used was one she had only ever heard in whispers associated with other people's tragedies: tumor. The room seemed to contract around her. The doctor's voice receded into background noise, replaced by the sound of her own pulse, heavy and unsteady in her ears. A tumor. The word etched itself into her mind, unyielding. It was no longer fatigue, no longer stress. It was something growing inside her, claiming her body as its own. Emily placed a hand on her arm, grounding her. "You're not alone," she whispered. But Sarah felt more alone in that moment than she ever had before. Walking out of the hospital, the world looked the same. The parking lot filled with cars, the sky wide and indifferent. But Sarah was not the same. Every step felt altered, heavier. She had carried invisible chains of judgment and contempt for years, but this was different. This was a chain fastened inside her, one she could not simply remove. Back at the Miller house, she said nothing. She moved through the rooms as if in a dream, folding clothes, cooking meals, listening to the familiar chorus of complaints and criticisms. Linda asked why the stew lacked flavor. Jessica remarked that the laundry smelled musty. Robert grunted his disapproval at some unseen detail. Daniel, as always, remained quiet. Sarah absorbed it all, her lips pressed into silence. Inside, though, the words from the doctor replayed endlessly. A mass, a tumor, treatment, surgery. She imagined herself in a hospital bed, pale beneath fluorescent lights, while this family looked on not with worry, but with judgment. Already, she could hear Linda's voice, cold and detached. "She can't even take care of herself. How can she take care of this family?" She could hear Jessica's mocking tone, could see Daniel's silence stretching like an unbridgeable gulf between them. The garden became her sanctuary more than ever. She knelt in the soil, tracing the stems of lavender, inhaling their calming fragrance. The flowers did not know of tumors or disdain. They only knew how to reach for the light, no matter how heavy the earth. Sarah wished she could be like them, simple in her purpose, unshaken by scorn. But at night, when she lay in bed beside Daniel, the fear grew louder. She wondered if he would hold her hand through what was to come, if he would finally speak for her, fight for her. Or would he remain silent, bound by the same fear that had kept him still all these years? She longed to ask, but her voice failed her. Fear of the answer silenced her more effectively than any criticism could. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sarah felt a wave of dizziness. The room tilted, her vision blurred. She steadied herself against the table, but Jessica's laugh cut through the haze. "Maybe she's been drinking," Jessica said, smirking. Linda shook her head, disapproving. "Always something with her." Daniel's fork clattered against his plate, but he said nothing more. Sarah excused herself, retreating to the garden once again, the cool night air against her flushed skin. She pressed her hands to her stomach, to the place where the tumor lived, and whispered into the darkness words no one would hear. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." The diagnosis had given shape to the exhaustion she had carried for months, but it also revealed something deeper. Her life as it was could not hold under this new weight. The Miller household had demanded her silence, her labor, her very sense of self. But illness demanded something else. It demanded truth. For the first time, Sarah began to imagine not just survival, but escape. She pictured a small apartment in town, sunlight spilling through open windows, her body healing without the constant sting of disdain. She pictured freedom. And though the thought terrified her, it also ignited a spark she had not felt in years. The diagnosis lived inside Sarah like a shadow that never lifted. Each morning, she rose to the same rhythm of chores, the same silence broken by criticism. But now, every step was accompanied by the awareness of what grew within her. It was not simply fatigue anymore, not headaches or dizziness. It was a presence she carried, an invader she could not wish away. She had not planned to tell the Millers immediately. Part of her wanted to keep the knowledge hidden, to hold it like a secret between herself and Emily, the only person who had shown her compassion. But illness has a way of revealing itself. The body does not hide what the spirit tries to bury. One afternoon, Sarah collapsed in the kitchen. The room spun, her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the counter before sliding to the floor. The sound of dishes clattering drew Linda and Jessica rushing in. Their eyes widened, but not with concern, rather with irritation, as though her weakness was yet another inconvenience. "Get up," Linda snapped, her voice sharp. "Don't make a scene." But Sarah could not rise quickly. Her breath came shallow, her skin pale. Daniel finally appeared, rushing to her side, his hands trembling as he tried to lift her. Robert stood in the doorway. Expression unreadable. Arms crossed as though waiting for an explanation. It was in the sterile light of the hospital that the truth could no longer be hidden. Tests confirmed the tumor words written in black and white across a medical chart. The doctor explained the urgency, the need for treatment, the gravity of what Sarah faced. Daniel sat beside her, his hand hovering near hers, but not quite holding it. Linda and Jessica stood in the corner, their faces masks of discomfort rather than sympathy. When the family returned home, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, the paper from the hospital still crumpled in her hand. She listened as voices rose from downstairs. "She's sick." Jessica's tone was biting, laced with disdain. "You know what this means, don't you? She won't be able to do anything around here, Mayu. Everything will fall on us." Linda's sigh was heavy. "I warned Daniel. I knew she wasn't strong enough. Now look, she'll drain us dry with hospital bills and pity." Robert muttered something too low to catch, but Sarah did not need to hear it. She understood. They did not see her as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, as a person fighting for her life. They saw her as a burden. Later, when she entered the living room, their conversation ceased, but the silence was louder than their words. Linda looked at her with cool detachment, Jessica with open contempt. "You should rest," Linda said, though her tone carried no kindness. "We'll have to make other arrangements for the chores. This house can't stop functioning just because—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, but Sarah heard it clearly, "just because you are failing." Jessica smirked, arms folded across her chest. "Daniel deserves better than to be chained to someone who can't even take care of herself." The words sliced through Sarah sharper than the diagnosis itself. She glanced at Daniel, hoping, praying for his voice to rise in her defense. But he sat motionless, his gaze lowered, his silence screaming louder than Jessica's cruelty. That was the breaking point. The chains that had bound Sarah for years, the invisible weight of criticism and dismissal, suddenly felt unbearable. She realized then that the illness inside her was not her only battle. She was fighting against a family that would never see her as more than a mistake, against a husband too weak to choose her over the comfort of compliance. She retreated to the garden that evening, the air cool against her flushed skin. The flowers bent gently in the breeze, fragile yet resilient. She sank to the ground, her hands pressing into the soil, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The garden had always been her sanctuary, but tonight it became something more, a place of reckoning. She whispered into the night words that trembled but carried truth. "I cannot stay. Not here. Not anymore." The breaking point was not a moment of rage, but of clarity. For years she had endured in the hope of belonging, in the hope that sacrifice would earn love. But sacrifice without recognition only destroys. She saw now that the Millers would never change, that Daniel's silence would never transform into strength. If she remained, she would lose more than her health, she would lose herself completely. That night she lay awake beside Daniel. He slept fitfully, unaware of the storm raging within her. She studied the outline of his face in the moonlight, the man she had once believed would shield her from the world. She realized she loved him still, but love was no longer enough. Love without respect, without defense, was hollow. It could not sustain her through illness. In the silence, Sarah made her decision. She would leave. Not tomorrow, not in some distant future when circumstances aligned, but soon. Before the illness consumed her, before the Millers' disdain crushed what little remained of her spirit. The breaking point had arrived, and with it a fragile, desperate hope. The sky broke open that evening, heavy rain spilling over the rooftops, drumming against the windows of the Miller house. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and insistent, like the beating of a drum announcing an inevitable end. Sarah stood by the window of the bedroom she shared with Daniel, watching the rain trace frantic lines across the glass. It felt like the heavens were echoing the storm within her, a storm that had been building for years, but had now reached its peak. Her body was frail, weakened by the weight of her illness, but her spirit, fragile though it was, had begun to harden into resolve. The cruelty of Linda's words, the venom in Jessica's laughter, the silence of Robert, and most painful of all, the weakness of Daniel had left scars deeper than the tumor inside her. She realized with an aching clarity that the house had never been her home. It was a cage, and every glance, every remark, every silence had been the bars closing tighter around her. That night, Sarah laid a sheet of paper on the small desk in the corner of the room. The lamplight glowed soft and golden, illuminating her trembling hand as she began to write. The words did not come easily, for how could one condense years of pain into a page? Yet she tried each sentence, a release, each word, a fragment of truth. I have given all of myself to this family. I have tried to be patient, to be kind, to belong. But my kindness was mistaken for weakness, my silence for guilt, and my presence for burden. I am not leaving because I do not love, but because love cannot survive without respect. I am sick, and I do not know what time I have left, but I refuse to spend that time unloved, unseen, unheard. I need to live, truly live, for whatever days remain. Forgive me, but I cannot stay. She signed her name, folded the paper carefully, and placed it on the nightstand beside Daniel's side of the bed. Her eyes lingered on the small wedding photo that still stood there, a reminder of the day she had once believed in forever. She touched the frame gently, her fingers tracing the younger version of herself, the smile that had not yet been dimmed by years of dismissal. The rain outside intensified, a curtain of water against the world. Sarah moved quietly, gathering a small bag she had packed earlier. Just the essentials, a change of clothes, her medical papers, a small packet of seeds from her garden, a promise to herself that she would grow life again, somewhere, somehow. Downstairs, the house was still. Robert had retreated to his chair, the television murmuring faintly. Linda's voice no longer carried through the rooms. She had gone to bed early. Jessica's door was shut. Laughter spilling faintly from her phone as she spoke to someone else unconcerned with the storm in the house. Daniel was in the living room, head bowed, lost in thought. He did not see Sarah pause at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes fixed on him. For a moment, she wanted to cross the room to press the letter into his hands to beg him to speak for her just once. But the silence between them was too vast, the years of inaction too heavy. She realized she could not wait for him to choose her. She had to choose herself. And so she opened the front door. The rain rushed in cold and merciless, soaking her instantly. She stepped into it as though into baptism, each drop washing away the chains that had bound her. Upstairs, minutes later, Daniel noticed the soft creak of the door. He rose, confusion prickling his chest, and hurried to the bedroom. His eyes fell on the folded paper on the nightstand. With trembling hands, he opened it. The words blurred as his eyes filled each line, striking like a hammer. He sank onto the bed, clutching the paper, the storm outside echoing the storm breaking inside him. By the time he stumbled to the front door, rain lashing against his face, Sarah was gone. The driveway was empty, the street deserted save for the sheets of water cascading from the sky. He called her name once, twice, but his voice was drowned by thunder. He stood in the downpour, the letter clutched in his fist, his tears indistinguishable from the rain. Sarah, meanwhile, walked with quiet determination through the storm. The streets were dark puddles rising around her feet, but she felt lighter than she had in years. Each step away from the Miller house was a step toward herself, toward freedom. She did not know what the future would hold, whether her body would heal, whether her days would be long or few, but she knew they would be hers. The night of departure was not just an escape. It was a reclamation. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of invisible chains fall away, leaving her battered but unbound. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the streets washed clean, the air cool and sharp with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Sarah woke in a small, unfamiliar room, her body still heavy from exhaustion, but her spirit strangely lighter. She had found a modest apartment on the edge of town, its walls bare, its furniture sparse, but to her it felt expansive, like the wide-open sky. For the first time in years, she awoke without the weight of disapproving eyes waiting for her at the breakfast table. The light filtered softly through thin curtains, casting pale gold across the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, a car passing, a dog barking in the distance, the faint sound of children laughing as they splashed in puddles left behind by the storm. Life continued indifferent to her leaving, yet she felt part of it in a way she hadn't before. It was as if the world had opened a door and she had finally stepped through. Her body was fragile, a constant reminder of the battle ahead. The tumor was still there, demanding treatment, demanding courage. But now, without the suffocating atmosphere of the Miller house, she could face it with clearer eyes. She placed the small packet of seeds she had carried from the garden onto the windowsill. It was a simple thing, but to Sarah it was a promise that even in new soil, life could bloom. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to settle into her new rhythm. She cooked meals for herself, simple dishes that carried no weight of judgment. She walked through the town square, exchanging polite greetings with strangers who saw her without prejudice, without expectation. Sometimes she visited Emily at the hospital, not just as a patient, but as a friend. Emily's presence reminded her that compassion still existed in the world, that connection could be gentle and genuine. The treatments were difficult. There were days when her strength faltered, when her body felt like a battlefield. But in those moments, she would sit by the window looking at the small shoots emerging from the soil of a flower pot where she had planted her seeds. Tiny green stems pushing through dirt, reaching for light despite the weight above them. They reminded her of herself, fragile but alive, still reaching. One evening, as she sipped tea and watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, she reflected on the life she had left behind. The Miller house stood in her memory like a monument to endurance, but not to love. She thought of Linda's sharp eyes, Jessica's smirk, Robert's silence. Daniel's stillness. Once she had believed their approval was the measure of her worth. Now she knew better. Her worth was not defined by a house that never saw her, by people who never heard her. Her worth was her own, written in the quiet strength that had carried her through storms, both within and without. She still loved Daniel in some small corner of her heart. Love does not vanish easily, even when wounded. But she understood now that love without respect is not a foundation. It is a fracture waiting to widen. Perhaps one day he would read her letter again and see it not as abandonment, but as truth. Perhaps he would change, or perhaps he would remain as he was. It no longer mattered. His silence no longer defined her. The dawn after the storm was not just a new day, it was a new beginning. Sarah felt it in the air and the warmth of sunlight on her skin, in the quiet of her small apartment that belonged wholly to her. She had left behind chains that had bound her for too long. Now, even in the face of illness, she carried hope. She picked up a notebook and began to write. Not letters of apology, not pleas for recognition, but her own story. Words flowed slowly at first, then more steadily, capturing her journey, her pain, her resilience. She wrote because her voice mattered, because silence had been her prison and she had broken free. And as she closed the notebook, she whispered softly, almost like a prayer. If you are listening, if you have carried burdens that were never yours to bear, know this: you are not alone. You can step into the storm and find your dawn too. If Sarah's story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of your own strength in the face of storms, please subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you join a community where stories of resilience and healing are shared, where no one has to carry their chains in silence. Your support helps keep these voices alive, helps others find their dawn after the storm. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of rose and gold. Sarah sat by the window, her hand resting on the flower pot where new life had begun to sprout. The petals would come in time, but even now the small green shoots were enough. They were proof that even after the harshest storm, something tender could still grow. And, as the day gave way to night, Sarah felt peace settle within her. Not the peace of silence forced upon her, but the peace she had chosen. She was not cured, not yet, perhaps not ever, but she was free, and freedom, she realized, was its own kind of healing.